President John Adams said, "You will never know how much it costs the present generation to preserve your freedom. I hope you will make a good use of it." David Barton joined us here on Weekend Connection to discuss some of the little-known history of our country. We ran out of time then, but today we review some of what David had to say before and then expand on some more forgotten history and talk some more about the issue of slavery in the founding of America. My name is Mike Dyes. Now, let's get connected. David Barton is the founder and president of Wall Builders, a national pro-family organization that presents America's forgotten history and heroes, with an emphasis on our moral, religious, and constitutional heritage. David is the author of numerous best-selling books, with the subjects being drawn largely from his library of tens of thousands of original writings from the founding era. He also addresses well over 400 groups each year. You sound very busy. David, thank you for taking time for us here at Weekend Connection.
It is my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
At Wall Builders, you say that you strive to present America's forgotten history and heroes with an emphasis on moral, religious, and constitutional heritage. Why is it important to tell the stories of these often forgotten men and women?
One thing that God very much emphasizes is recall the former days, remember the former times. 1 Corinthians 10, you look at the birth of the New Testament church with the book of Acts, and you have Stephen there at the birth of the church, and the birth of the church is not a doctrinal dissertation, it's not a theological treatise, it's a history lesson. Mordecai was saved in the Old Testament because the king had insomnia, said, "Bring me something to read." They brought him the book. He saw that Mordecai saved his life. The next morning he asked Haman, "What should I do for somebody who saved my life?" And Haman says, "You got to be talking about me," and lays out this grand plan. And it's because the king read his own history book that the gallows of Haman ended up hanging Haman rather than Mordecai. You have with Josiah, he's trying to bring the nation back to God. What a great deal, rebuild the temple. But in the process of doing that, they found that old scroll. They brought it out. They said, "You mean we used to be like this?" It led to a national revival. Throughout the Bible, God uses history to achieve revivals, to bring people back to their stands, to help us not repeat stupid mistakes from previous generations. And when you go back and look and see how things have been, it's amazing.
We're talking with David Barton, founder and president of Wall Builders, reminding us of some of our forgotten American history. And one of the areas I wanted to talk about were maybe one or two of the early founding fathers who were actually preachers. John Merritt, I read about him. He was born in 1755, and some of his early life involved music, but he was greatly influenced by a great revival preacher, George Whitefield.
Yeah, John Merritt, a black American, he was from New York, but his mother sent him to South Carolina because he wanted to study music. And so at 11 years old, he leaves home. And we think that's really young. Not then. Usually by the time you were 13 in America, you were in university. So 11 years old, he is headed for South Carolina, and he took up the study of music, and he became really quite a child prodigy. He could play the French horn, he could do the violin, trumpet, and so he was really good on a variety of instruments, and actually would do concerts at that very young age of 11, 12, 13. He was doing concerts, and one day as he was on his way to play at one of those musical events, he and a friend passed a crowded pasture that was really open, and out in the middle of it there was this crowd, and they were gathered around a man who was kind of standing up, and as he said, he was hallooing or kind of shouting and being loud. And it was the Reverend George Whitefield, and it was the First Great Awakening. And Whitefield could often draw up to 100,000 to a crowd. It wasn't that many this time, but his friend kind of challenged him and said, "You know what?" He said, "Why don't you climb up that tree and disrupt the meeting?" And so John Merritt climbed up the tree. He gets ready to blow his horn, and George Whitefield whirls on his heel, points up at him, didn't even know he was back there, or nobody knew he was back there, and he points at him and says, "Prepare to meet thy God." When he said that, Merritt fell out of the tree and just hit the ground and just laid frozen there, laid still. And Whitefield didn't do anything. He just kept preaching, finished his sermon. Then he went over to the young boy and grabbed his hand and raised him up off the ground and ends up taking him home with him. And over the next 2 to 3 days, just kind of mentors him that God's got a plan for your life. God wants to do something special with you. And so the young boy, John, kind of says, yeah, I think God does too. I want to be a minister. So he writes his family and says, hey, I've just come to Christ. I'm going to be a minister. And they write him back and say, well, don't ever come home. We don't want your kind around. And so now here he is, 12, 13, and he's essentially an orphan. He's been kicked out of his family. And so he goes out wandering in the nearby woods, and there's a lot of Cherokee in the woods. And he says, as he's out in the woods, wandering around, he comes across a Cherokee brave, and they kind of become friends. The next few days, they hunt together in the woods and stay there. And as the Cherokee gets ready to go back to his village, he looks at John and says, well, you're not doing anything. You don't have a place. So why don't you come with me? And so John accompanies the Cherokee brave back to the village. But the problem was, as soon as he walked in, and here's John Morant, a black American, and he walks into this village. The Cherokee chief sees him and points at him and tells the other braves, he's not one of us, kill him. And so they come after John to surround him and kill him. And John began to preach a sermon to them. And he actually preached in Cherokee. And it's like, where did he learn Cherokee? And he preached a sermon, and it ends up that he converts the chief of the tribe, and the chief says to John, hey, why don't you just live among us and go to the other Cherokee villages and talk. So at the age of 13, that right around that 13, 14, John Morant becomes the first black American successfully to evangelize Native Americans. And it's like, how come we never hear about John Morant? This is an unbelievable story, and this is in the Great Awakening leading up to the American Revolution. When the Revolution came, the British actually took him and impressed him into the British Navy, so he was forced to fight on the British side. But John is quite an American story for Black History Month that we never hear about as a minister, the Reverend John Morant.
We're talking with David Barton, founder and president of Wall Builders, reminding us of some of our forgotten American history. And as I was looking at your website, David, I came across a few of the men that we're talking about. And just talking to you before the interview, you mentioned the first double spy. Tell me about him. I didn't read about him.
As they're in Virginia, a black man, James Armistead, comes to General Lafayette. And Lafayette was one of the many founding fathers who was just hardcore anti-slavery. And so black patriot James Armistead goes over into the British camp. And he straggles in and he says, oh, I hate the Americans. They're all a bunch of slave owners and they mistreat me. And you kind British, will you take me in? And so they take him in and they use him to start serving the generals. And so he serves the generals, and they assign him to one general in particular, a guy named Benedict Arnold. Oh, that's the traitor. And every night he smuggles that information back to Lafayette and Washington. Says, here's what they're going to do. Here's what they're... And after this goes on for some while, Lord Cornwallis, who's the head of the British forces, comes to James and says, James, I know you really hate those Americans, and I know they mistreated you, I know they abused you, but I'm going to ask you to do something really, really hard. Would you consider going back into the American camp and being a spy for us, the British? Let us know what they're doing. And so he goes back to the American camp, and what he does is he feeds all the right information to Washington and Lafayette and all the wrong information to Cornwallis, ends up helping us get Cornwallis cornered out on that peninsula, credited with shaving possibly months off the American Revolution by what he did through his intelligence work. And just a great story of this black patriot who wants to do something to help his country. We miss finding out about people like James Armistead, who is a great story from the American Revolution.
What were the founding fathers generally thinking when it came to slavery?
There's about 250 founding fathers, and today most people cannot name more than 4 or 5, and the ones they can name are usually slave owners. And they don't have a clue that there were more founding fathers who started abolition societies, who joined abolition societies, who participated in abolition societies, than there were slave owners by far. And you'll find out that even with those who owned slaves, like Thomas Jefferson, we're told he's a racist bigot, and they're calling right now for his statue to be taken out of the University of Missouri and for the Jefferson Memorial to be torn down and for his face to be taken off Mount Rushmore and his face to come off the nickel, etc. And I've got to stop and ask a question and say, well, no, wait a minute. Why is it that for 200 years, black civil rights leaders praised Jefferson as one of the greatest anti-slavery voices in America? And we're talking Frederick Douglass, the great the great abolitionist black patriot from the Civil War who helped do the Emancipation Proclamation, who helped start the Massachusetts 54th Black. How come he says, I learned that all men were created equal from Thomas Jefferson? And how come Dr. Martin Luther King praised Jefferson for his views on wanting to end slavery and equal civil rights? And how come other black civil rights leaders like Henry Highland Garnett and Francis Grimke and Benjamin Banneker and so many others, did these black leaders not know Jefferson and slavery? And then I say, well, how about John Quincy Adams? He's called the hellhound of abolition. There's not a white guy who hated slavery more than John Quincy Adams, and yet he praises Jefferson for all the work he did to end slavery. Yeah, but Jefferson owned slaves. That's true. But Jefferson, in his own writing, said that the laws of the state of Virginia made it impossible for him to free his own slaves. What he did was, as soon as he got elected in Virginia, he went to the state legislature, started introducing anti-slavery laws to end slavery in Virginia. He and Richard Bland did that. Not only did they shout him down, they tried to beat him up. I mean, they physically wanted to assault him for trying to end slavery in Virginia. Then as he gets to the National Congress, he's elected to the Continental Congress, Jefferson introduces a law to end slavery in all of America. It failed by one vote. And Jefferson in his diary said, oh, would to God that he had changed one heart, and we could have ended slavery. So he's working not only in America, but he works across the seas in other nations to help end slavery. He goes into court, fighting against slavery in court. I mean, the guy does so much. 1781, the first book he ever wrote, chapter 18, deals with a straight-out condemnation of slavery, how bad it is, how that it makes slave owners into despots, but he's not allowed to free his own slaves in the state of Virginia. George Washington did, because they gave a reprieve in the law in 1782, changed it and said, well, okay, we'll let you on your death free slaves. And so when Washington died, he freed slaves. But they changed that law back after that, so Jefferson couldn't even free his slaves on his death. They were so pro-slavery in Virginia that one of Jefferson's neighbors, Robert Carter, who had 500 slaves, freed them all. 75 years later, they're still trying to free the slaves that he freed. That's how bad the Virginia laws were. Now, that again is a Southern view of slavery, because when you go up to New England area and you find John Adams and you find Sam Adams and you find Roger Sherman and these guys, I mean, they're condemning slavery big time. Ben Franklin condemned slavery. James Wilson, signer of the Declaration and Constitution, writes a law book saying slavery violates the Bible and it violates the laws of nature. You have people like Stephen Hopkins from Rhode Island, who signed the first anti-slavery law in America once we separated from Great Britain. But see, nobody knows the names of those founders, and the other founders they do know, like Jefferson, they say, well, he has to be a bigot because he owned slaves. Now, he tried his best to get rid of slavery. Now, not every founding father did. I would say about 15% of the founding fathers were hardcore racist. About 80% weren't. 85% weren't. And we hear the 15%, not the 85%, and then we get thrown Jefferson, who definitely was anti-slavery but couldn't free his slaves, and we don't even get the rest of the story about him. So founding fathers were really pretty strong about anti-slavery. And the final thing I'll throw out is that in 1773, Rhode Island and then Connecticut and then Massachusetts and Pennsylvania passed laws, anti-slavery laws. In 1774, King George III struck down every single anti-slavery law and said, you're part of the British Empire. We have slavery, and as long as you're part of us, you're going to have slavery too. And that's when a number of founding fathers said, well, great, let's not be part of the British Empire anymore because we don't want slavery. So Ben Franklin, Benjamin Rush, signers of the Declaration, that's why they got involved within slavery. When Jefferson wrote the Declaration, one of the clauses on why we separate from Great Britain was the king will not let us end slavery. He keeps forcing it on us. South Carolina, Georgia, and North Carolina made Jefferson take that clause out of the Declaration. But that was one of the grievances of the founding fathers, that the king won't let us end slavery. So once we signed the Declaration in 1776, right then they started abolishing slavery across New England areas. You go through Massachusetts, you go through Vermont, you go through other states. We're abolishing slavery because we're not British colonies anymore. And that represents what the founding fathers believed and felt. And so we just don't get that perspective today.
I think it's ironic that Virginia, which became the capital, Richmond, of the Confederacy, had actually voted to end the slave trade in 1773. Think how different our history would have been if it had been ended back in the 1700s, if slavery had ended then instead of lingering on to the middle of the 1800s.
Yeah, and it's interesting that it was Thomas Jefferson who introduced a law in Virginia to end the slave trade that got passed in 1773. They ended the importation of slaves, and in 1808, he's the one who signed the law to ban the importation of slaves in the United States in total. And so Jefferson had been key, and had we been able to pass that law that Jefferson wanted back in the 1780s when he was in the Continental Congress, what a different outcome would have been for America over the next several hundred years.
Certainly.
No question.
They can find you at wallbuilders.org, correct?
Wallbuilders.org or wallbuilders.com, either one. And on the website, we have a section there just for Black history as well.
All right. And if they want to call you, the number 817-441-6044 or wallbuilders.com or wallbuilders.org. Either one works. Thank you, David Barton, for coming and talking with us today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me. God bless.
My name is Mike Dyes. Join us again next week for Weekend Connection.
Thank you for listening to this feature, a production of BBN, the Bible Broadcasting Network. BBN provides 24-hour Christian programming, great Christian music, and Bible teaching. Listen to BBN by clicking the link in the description.